The old veteran's eyes darkened as he leaned in close to the wide-eyed cadets. Listen up, rookies. When dealing with humans, there's one rule above all. Don't provoke them. Push a human into a corner and they'll tear you apart with their bare hands. The Ithorians learned that the hard way centuries ago, and it nearly cost them everything. Mark Perry, gnarled fingers tracing the jagged scar across his cheek, settled back in his seat aboard the dimly lit spacecraft. The young soldiers huddled closer, hanging on his every word. "I was there when the Ithorian fleet arrived in Earth's orbit," Mark began, his voice low and gravelly. "Their Emperor Raxor thought humanity would be an easy conquest, just another primitive species to crush beneath his insectoid feet." The cadets shifted uneasily, imagining the looming warships and the fear that must have gripped their ancestors. Mark's gaze grew distant as he recalled those tense days. Earth's leaders were faced with an impossible choice: surrender or be annihilated. Our technology was no match for the Ithorians. They'd already enslaved dozens of other races, and we were next on their list. He paused, letting the weight of the situation sink in. The cadets knew the story, but hearing it from someone who had lived it made it all too real. "I was part of the hastily assembled defense force," Mark continued. "We were outnumbered and outgunned, but we weren't going down without a fight. Some of the brass wanted to surrender, but others, myself included, knew that meant a fate worse than death." The old soldier's fists clenched as he remembered the heated debates, the desperate search for a solution. With time running out and the Ithorians growing impatient, we knew we had to act. But what could we do against such overwhelming odds? He leaned forward, his eyes boring into the cadets. "That's when we decided to do the unthinkable. A bold all-or-nothing strike against the heart of the Ithorian fleet. It was a gamble, but it was our only chance. If we failed, humanity would be wiped out. But if we succeeded—" Mark trailed off, a fierce smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The cadets held their breath, waiting for him to continue, their hearts pounding at the thought of the impossible mission their predecessors had undertaken. "The stakes were higher than they'd ever been," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The fate of our entire species hung in the balance. We knew that the Ithorians would stop at nothing to enslave or destroy us, and we were the only thing standing in their way." The cadets leaned in closer, desperate to hear more, their minds racing with the implications of Mark's tale. They knew that they were the inheritors of this legacy, the guardians of a future that had been bought with the blood and sacrifice of those who had come before. And as Mark's story unfolded, they began to understand the true meaning of the phrase, "Humans, don't provoke them." Mark's voice grew hushed as he recounted the desperate plan hatched by Earth's military leaders. They knew that the only way to have a chance was to cut the head off the snake, to assassinate Emperor Raxor himself. Mark himself was chosen to lead a small strike team. They would infiltrate the Ithorian flagship, fight their way to the Emperor's chambers, and eliminate him. The brass hoped that with Raxor dead, the Ithorian fleet would fall into disarray, buying humanity some time. The team was outfitted with experimental cloaking tech and the most advanced weapons Earth had. Mark exhaled slowly as he recalled slipping past the flagship's defenses, his heart pounding in his ears. Once aboard, all hell broke loose. Alarms blared as Mark and his men cut down scores of insectoid soldiers, their chitinous armor no match for human firepower. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of smoke and death. By the time they reached Raxor's chambers, only Mark and 2 others remained. The Emperor's elite guard put up a fierce fight, and Mark's comrades fell, leaving him alone to confront Raxor. The imposing Ithorian rose to face him, compound eyes glittering with malice. He was a warrior and a formidable one. They clashed in a brutal melee, Mark's rifle against Raxor's crackling energy glaive. Blow after blow they traded, neither giving ground. Mark took a searing slash to the chest, Raxor a shot to his thorax that oozed green ichor. Both were battered, bleeding, pushed to the brink. But in a final desperate lunge, Mark drove his combat knife into Raxor's eye. The Emperor shuddered and collapsed, a final breath rattling from his mandibles. Mark stood over the corpse, gasping, triumphant. But his elation was short-lived. He saw on the view screens that the Ithorian fleet, far from being dismayed, was in a frenzy. Ships realigned, weapons charged, all turning towards Earth. A new figure appeared on the screens, another Ithorian, sleeker and even more sinister than Raxor. Raxor's successor, Mark realized with dawning horror, and he looked enraged. "Soldiers of the Ithorian Empire," the new emperor hissed, "the humans have dared to strike down our glorious leader. This insult cannot stand. We will descend upon their world, raze their cities, and reduce their species to cinders. Let Earth be an example to all who would defy us." Mark watched helplessly as the Ithorian fleet began to advance, a swarm of angry hornets ready to descend upon Earth. His mission had failed. In killing Raxor, he had only sealed humanity's fate. He slumped against a bulkhead, vision blurring from his wounds, as the ominous shapes of Ithorian warships filled the viewscreens, growing ever larger as they approached Earth, ready to unleash their terrible vengeance. Mark slumped in the cockpit of the escape pod, his blood pooling on the seat. He clutched his side, trying to staunch the flow from the wound that Raxor's energy glaive had torn open. Each ragged breath sent a fresh wave of agony through his chest, and his vision swam as he struggled to remain conscious. Through the pod's viewport, he could see the Ithorian fleet raining down destruction upon the Earth. Brilliant beams of energy lanced down from the alien ships, turning cities to molten slag in an instant. The planet's surface was soon obscured by thick clouds of smoke and ash, lit from beneath by the angry glow of 1,000 fires. Mark's heart clenched as he thought of the millions of lives being snuffed out with each passing second. His family, his friends, everyone he had ever known or cared about, all gone in a heartbeat. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with the blood and grime as he watched his world burn. But beneath the grief, a white-hot rage began to build. The Ithorians had to pay for what they had done. Mark gritted his teeth, his hands clenching into fists. He would avenge the fallen, even if it took his last breath. As his pod drifted through the debris field that had once been Earth's orbital defenses, Mark's thoughts began to grow hazy. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, he felt the pod shudder as something latched onto it. A human freighter had spotted his distress beacon and pulled him aboard. The crew, a ragtag bunch of smugglers and mercenaries, looked at Mark with a mix of awe and pity as they pulled him from the pod. They had heard the reports of what had happened to Earth, and they knew that this battered soldier was likely one of the few survivors. Over the next few weeks, as the freighter jumped from system to system to avoid Ithorian patrols, the crew nursed Mark back to health. They shared what little information they had gleaned, that the remnants of Earth's military had gone to ground, seeking shelter among sympathetic alien species and plotting their revenge. As soon as he was able, Mark sought out these resistance cells. He found them in the darkest corners of the galaxy, hidden in asteroid bases and on remote moons, and among them he found a familiar face, Admiral Jack Hawkins, his old mentor and friend. Hawkins had managed to escape Earth with a handful of ships and a few thousand survivors. Now he was leading the fight against the Ithorians, using hit-and-run tactics to strike at their weak points. Mark joined Hawkins' group without hesitation. He threw himself into the fight, leading daring raids against Ithorian supply depots and weapons factories. He became a ghost, a legend whispered about among the Ithorian ranks, the human who had killed an emperor and now sought to bring down an empire. Under Mark and Hawkins' leadership, the resistance began to grow. They reached out to other species who had suffered under Ithorian rule, forging alliances and sharing resources. The Ithorians soon found themselves facing not just a handful of human survivors, but a galactic uprising. The turning point came when Mark led a mission to infiltrate an Ithorian research facility. There they discovered plans for a terrifying new weapon, a device capable of destroying entire planets. The Ithorians called it the World Ender, and it was almost complete. Mark and his team barely managed to escape with the plans, losing several good soldiers in the process. But now they knew what they were up against, and they knew they had to act fast. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Mark's heart raced as he powered up the stealth craft, going over the plan one last time with Sergeant Luis Rodriguez and the rest of his hand-picked team. They had to destroy the world ender before the Ithorians could unleash it on the galaxy. Remember, we're not just fighting for humanity anymore. If we don't stop the Ithorians here, no one will be safe. Too many have suffered under their rule already, Mark said, his voice steely with resolve. The others nodded grimly, checking their weapons and gear. As they approached the Ithorian homeworld, Mark guided the craft through the planet's dense asteroid belt, using the rocky debris to mask their approach. The facility housing the world ender loomed ahead, a massive fortified complex bristling with defenses. "Stick to the plan," Mark said as they touched down on the facility's outer perimeter. "We breach the outer defenses, fight our way to the control room, and sabotage the weapons core. Then we get the hell out before it blows." They moved swiftly, Mark taking point with Luis close behind. Alarms blared as they breached the outer doors, Ithorian soldiers swarming to meet them. Mark and his team cut through them with brutal efficiency, their weapons spitting fire in the dim corridors. As they fought deeper into the facility, the resistance grew fiercer. Ithorian elites in heavy armor, their energy weapons sizzling through the air. Mark took a glancing shot to the shoulder, gritting his teeth against the pain as he gunned down the attacker. At last they reached the central control room, the doors hissing open to reveal the Ithorian Emperor himself, flanked by his personal guard. "Did you really think you could stop us, human?" the Emperor hissed, his mandibles clicking. "The world ender will be your species' downfall." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Mark snarled, launching himself at the Emperor. His team engaged the guards, the room erupting into a maelstrom of gunfire and flashing blades. Mark and the Emperor traded blows, the Ithorian's exoskeleton deflecting Mark's shots. The Emperor lashed out with his energy glaive, searing Mark's flesh, but Mark fought on, fueled by rage and desperation. Beside him, Luis battled two guards at once, his rifle clicking empty. He switched to his combat knife, ducking and weaving, but he was a split second too slow, one of the guard's blades catching him in the gut. Luis went down with a cry, blood pooling beneath him. "Luis!" Mark yelled, blasting the guards aside and dropping to his friend's side. Luis gripped Mark's hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Finish the mission, Mark," he choked out. "Destroy that thing, for Earth, for all of us." His eyes glazed over, his hand going slack in Mark's. Mark surged to his feet, grief and fury coursing through him. He charged the Emperor, tackling him to the ground. They grappled, the Emperor's claws tearing at Mark's flesh, but Mark managed to get a hand on his pistol, pressing it under the Emperor's chin and pulling the trigger. The Emperor went limp, ichor splattering the floor. Mark staggered to the control panel, his vision blurring. He inputted the self-destruct sequence with shaking fingers. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. He had minutes before the whole place went up. Mark fought his way back through the facility, Ithorian soldiers dogging his every step. His wounds screamed with each movement, blood loss making his head swim. But he pushed on, Luis's last words echoing in his mind. He burst from the facility just as the first explosions began, the ground shaking beneath his feet. He sprinted for the extraction point, ducking weapons fire from the surviving Ithorians. Just as his ship came into view, a figure stepped out from behind a rock formation. The Emperor, battered but alive, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won, human," he snarled, advancing on Mark. "All you've done is seal your own fate." Mark met the Emperor's charge head-on, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. They traded blows, fists and feet, each seeking to end the other. Mark's vision narrowed, the world fading away, until there was nothing but him and the Emperor, locked in mortal combat. The Emperor's claws raked Mark's face, nearly taking out an eye. Mark retaliated with a crushing blow to the Emperor's throat, feeling the Ithorian's exoskeleton crack under his fist. The Emperor staggered, gurgling, and Mark pressed his advantage, raining down blows until the Emperor collapsed. His chest caved in. Mark stood over the Emperor's corpse, chest heaving, As the World Ender facility exploded behind him, the shockwave nearly knocking him off his feet, he stared at the rising fireball, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. They had struck a crippling blow against the Ithorians today. Luis and the others had not died in vain. Mark staggered back to his ship, every fibre of his being aching with exhaustion and grief. The Emperor was dead, the planet killer destroyed, but the cost had been immense. He thought of Luis, of all the brave men and women who had given their lives to make this victory possible. Their sacrifices would not be forgotten. As he lifted off from the Ithorian homeworld, Mark opened a comms channel to the Resistance fleet. "The Emperor is dead," he said, his voice ragged. "The planet killer is no more. Begin the final assault." Across the galaxy, the Resistance forces surged into action. Human ships, joined by those of their alien allies, struck at Ithorian strongholds and supply lines. The Ithorians, reeling from the loss of their leader and their ultimate weapon, crumbled under the onslaught. Reports flooded in of Ithorian forces retreating, surrendering en masse. Planets that had long suffered under Ithorian rule rose up in rebellion, overthrowing their oppressors. But even as the tide turned, the scars of war were plain to see. Mark returned to Earth to find a world in ruins. The great cities lay in rubble, the landscape scorched and lifeless. The human population, once numbering in the billions, had been reduced to a mere fraction of its former size. In the midst of the devastation, the survivors of the Resistance gathered. They mourned the fallen, sharing stories of heroism and sacrifice. Mark stood among them, his heart heavy with the weight of all they had lost. Yet even in their grief there was a spark of hope. They had won their freedom, not just for themselves but for countless other species, and now they had a chance to build something new from the ashes of the old. In the years that followed, Mark worked tirelessly alongside his fellow survivors to rebuild. They cleared the rubble, replanted the fields, re-established contact with the scattered remnants of humanity across the stars. Slowly, painfully, life began to return to normal. Cities rose from the ruins. The population began to recover. But the scars of the war remained, both on the earth and in the hearts of those who had lived through it. As the years turned to decades, Mark found himself standing before a new generation of cadets, their faces eager and full of promise. They had grown up in a world shaped by the sacrifices of Mark's generation, a world free from the threat of Ithorian tyranny. Mark looked out at them, seeing in their eyes the same fire that had driven him and his comrades all those years ago. He knew that the future of humanity rested on their shoulders, just as it had on his. "Remember this story," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. "Remember the sacrifices that were made, the lessons that were learned. We humans are stronger than we know, capable of great things when we stand together. But we must also be cautious. There will always be those who seek to destroy what we have built. We must be ready to defend ourselves, to fight for what we believe in. But we must also strive for peace, for understanding. It is through cooperation, not conquest, that we will find our true place in the galaxy." As the cadets filed out of the room, ready to take their place as the defenders of a new era, Mark felt a sense of both pride and trepidation. They had won the war, yes, but the struggle was far from over. There would always be new threats, new challenges to face. But he knew that as long as humanity stood together, as long as they remembered the lessons of the past, they would never be defeated. The Ithorian war had tested them, pushed them to the brink of annihilation, but in the end, it had only made them stronger. And as Mark sat in the quiet of the empty room, he knew that no matter what the future held, that strength would endure. The resilience of the human spirit would carry them forward to whatever lay ahead. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.